Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Wilfred Reilly, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University, author of the new book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. And Will Reilly, thanks for joining us once again on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Yeah, great to be back on.
You know, you talk in the beginning of the book, kind of leading up to things, that there's this presumption, and I've heard it in my own education, that American history is being taught from the political right. I'd love for you to address that. Is that actually accurate?
Well, no, that's completely nonsensical. And that's one of the things, I mean, the academic professoriate leans about 93% to the left. In high school education, it's a little more balanced, but I mean, it's about 80% female, which isn't inherently bad, but again, about 70% to the political left. So that's something that struck me when I looked at the textbooks and so on that were being used. There was this very prevalent idea. I mean, if you look at Lies My Teacher Told Me, which again is a book that sold considerably more copies than mine, at least at this point. I mean, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, you know, A Native History of the USA, and the lies they're telling you is usually the context in these books. You know, 1619, A Black History of the USA, you know, Howard Zinn, A People's History of the USA. The impression that's being given is very much, you know, what you learn about your country is being told to you from the right wing by these twisted, over-patriotic capitalists. But when you look at higher ed itself, that can't be true. So there are kind of two things there. I mean, one, the narrative that people are actually getting from modern secondary education and higher education is most of the time profoundly negative. I mean, there's a very big emphasis on the idea that the Western culture, you know, European descent, white descent, culture in the Americas is one of the worst cultures of all time. We, quote unquote, killed the Indians. We held black slaves, and sometimes white indentured servants are mentioned as well. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. We dropped big bombs on our military opponents, this kind of thing. And the implication, of course, is that no one else ever did this. And the second point is that if you know this, you're somehow a member of the elect. So, I mean, I've said in other interviews, like the textbooks will have a little note on the side that says, like, now your dad probably doesn't know that much about feminism, like this type of thing. What I noticed, because, I mean, I just mentioned 4 famous best-selling books that are used in every school. Yes. What I noticed is, first of all, the critique of Western culture is nonsensical. Western culture is not the worst human culture. It's probably the best all time. The sins that I described are universal human sins, conflict between men and women, with men getting the best of it. That goes back to Adam and Eve, if you're a religious person, and women got the best of it that time, if you want to look at it in that sense. You know, warfare is the definitional state of mankind. I mean, we find bones that are 6,000 years old with shattered cranial cases. Slave is one of the 20 oldest human words. There's an Egyptian hieroglyph and a piece of Samian cuneiform that means slave. The word, you might be interested to know, just means defeated warrior. So Western culture didn't do anything original in most of these arenas. The Western contribution very often, as with slavery, was ending some kind of decaying, decadent practice that existed in, you know, quote unquote, the glorious Oriental monarchies. So that's one thing. And point 2, though, I think is more important, which is these ideas like democratic socialism, you know, moderate feminism, political liberalism, they're not original at all. There's nothing rebellious or cool about them. They're the mainstream ideas of one of the 2 biggest political parties in the country. It's like presenting George W. Bush as cool. You know, the books that I'm reading are the textbooks in the school. So you have this weird situation where the people that are in power, like a center-left Democrat is the president, are presenting themselves as the resistance. You actually see this in those terms, like online on Twitter and Facebook, like people with big blue waves in their profile picture that are like congressmen. So the question, getting to the point, the question I ask in the book is, okay, so these people are now in charge. We obviously are not, the college professoriates obviously don't lean to the right. I'm not even going to dignify that with consideration. But do the people that are actually producing knowledge from the left, are they telling the truth? Are we talking about Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt sort of Democrats, or is a lot of what they say false? And what I find is that a lot of what they say is just nonsensical. I mean, you know, I look through the Native American contributions curriculum and this kind of thing, 1619 Project, and a lot of it's just gibberish, no offense to individual authors. So I wrote a book about that.
I guess the question leads me to several different areas, Will, but one of them is, are there alternative sources? Are there textbooks that are actually rational? Are these people just captured by the textbooks industry, or is the cart driving the horse?
There is an entire alternative world to mainstream kind of captured academia. I mean, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, and we've got just a ton of books. I mean, there's Left Behind in Rosedale, which is one of the classic books about racial conflict, Not Stolen, which is Jeff Finpal's, a very honest description of the white native wars. He doesn't really spare either side. You know, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond's classic alternative to genetic hereditarianism. I mean, you might say the counter to that, I've got Steve Saylor's Noticing. You know, I don't put limits on what I read. You've got David Bernstein's Classified, making fun of how he came up with our race categories. The Scramble for Africa. I mean, Empire of the Summer Moon. I'd recommend everyone get that book. That's by S.C. Gwynn, talking about the rise of the Comanche Empire. But I mean, one thing I notice about those books is that virtually everyone I mentioned is coming either from a small college, you're talking about, as I am myself, but you're talking about maybe the Hillsdales, a lot of them lean a little more to the right, or they're coming from the think tank sector where you're talking about Manhattan Institute, that kind of thing. Or they are coming from upper end journalism. Someone took a break from Newsweek or the Daily Spectator to write a book. It would be very hard to put out that kind of content from through a mainstream textbook house today. Obviously, none of those are textbooks, but also through like the sociology department at Yale. So I'd encourage people to continue scanning the bestseller list. I mean, just looking, The Case for Colonialism by Bruce Gilley. I mean, there's a whole bookshelf right here. But I'd encourage people just to keep scanning the bestseller list and that kind of thing. But be aware that a lot of what you're looking at is going to be considered heterodox today, whereas it would have been considered totally mainstream 25 years ago, because the people that keep calling themselves rebels are in power. For parents, if you're interested in alternative textbooks, I will say there's an entire homeschooling text market. So, from everything from non-racist but pro-black to Christian, that's a good source. There are 30 or 40 independent textbook publishers that, I've been contacted that reach out to pretty normal authors and put together entire books. But the absolute mainstream of academia right now, of high school teaching right now, is very dominated by this kind of stuff. Like, there's a gender panel in the first page of the book describing, how people might be addressed and that sort of thing. And that's kind of a warning sign when you see something like that.
Well, let's talk about this threat that Western civilization poses. Clearly, it's a threat because it's under attack. What are they afraid of?
Well, the interesting thing here is that the call is coming from inside the house. I'm sure there's some Chinese and Arab money involved in these campaigns. Those are our great, almost honorable rivals, right, and have been for 2,000 years. But I think the threat Western society poses to its primary haters, who tend to be pseudo-Marxists or radical feminists, people along a bunch of these tranche lines, anti-natalists, so on, within Western culture. The threat it poses is that it will continue to exist to some extent. The USA is a very free society, unlike China or Saudi Arabia or even India. And so we have within the USA massive collations of people that don't like the country. And their goal is that the nation be radically changed. There are multiple polls of young people where if you add up the answers together, 30 to 40% of them would like America to be a majority minority, and I don't really care that much about that one myself, but a majority minority, socialist rather than capitalist, a disarmed country with a totally different foreign policy. which actually kind of resembles the foreign policy that the extreme America First right wants, by the way. But like all of this would be changed. And in order to change this, to move away from kind of a robust corn-fed patriotism, I think a lot of people have realized you need to be instrumental. Like you need to change the way people think of the country. So like part of the reparations debate is very much telling people that the USA is a wicked country. We are wealthy because we stole from African slaves. So if we are moral, we should give 30% of our wealth or whatever to black people. So if you look at reparations figures, they're generally based around that kind of thing. They're crazy amounts of money, like $80 billion, that represent, X percent of GDP. Like a serious reparations policy, not to go off on a rambling sideline here, but a serious reparations policy would be based on looking at the gap in wealth between blacks and whites, which currently is, $100,000 for a full family, and then adjusting for age, the modal age of a black man's 27, white man's 58, region of the country, more black people live in the poorer South, and tested IQ, a bunch of other things, and seeing what a percentage of that 100,000 remains. It's when I did this, it was like $34,000. And then deciding, what percentage of that is due to racism, and then, perhaps giving that to families. It would be, a nice boost, but it wouldn't be a massive amount of money. That's not what's being proposed. What's being proposed is this idea of compensating for all of America's past. And in order to do that, you have to teach a negative narrative about what the country was. I genuinely believe this.
Curious about these imbalances in the professoriate and even at the high school level. Is this because right-minded or fair-minded conservative people are not going into education, or because they're not being let in?
Well, I think it's a combination. I mean, so I've had at least, I teach at Kentucky State, which is a historically black college, but it's located in Appalachia, so it's in fact quite integrated. And a lot of Southern African Americans, certainly males, are pretty conservative. And I've had a lot of kind of white guys and black jocks, is a phrase that comes to mind, say that they would not consider going on into higher education because of the sort of the crazy ideological slant. Like if you're interested in getting a PhD in sociology and you're a white, or for that matter, a black ex-Marine from Paducah, Kentucky, and you start looking at these applications and seeing the DEI statement and your statement of support for the gender identity of your future classmates and so on, I mean, you probably start realizing what that would entail, and you start thinking about the business world or the think tank sector or being a private quant instead. So you do see, as someone who does statistical analysis, you do see some weird imbalances where like the think tanks lean pretty heavily to the right, and sort of heterodox institutions like the University of Austin lean pretty heavily to the right. Like everything that's around academia slants right because there's this huge pool of very qualified people that really just don't go into full-on 5-year PhD academia. Now, if you do go into full-on 5-year PhD academia, I think that's where kept out becomes a little more relevant. Like, I know top young scholars like Zach Goldberg. I mean, that's the guy who coined the term Great Awakening, who have very little chance of getting hired in a lot of these fields, who are kind of, right-leaning white guys. And yeah, most of them, I mean, I think he got picked up by Manhattan Institute. Those guys are not going to get retained by like Yale's sociology program. I mean, no offense to them. It's just not going to happen. So you kind of, once you get to that point where 80% of the people, 90% of the people are partisan Democrats or even communists, it becomes a difficult system to change. My buddy Chris Rufo would say that you have to change it basically through external political action. The governor has to ban DEI or something. Like at that point, people aren't just going to step forward and say, my entire department's corrupt and I should be fired. I mean, no one's logically going to make that move.
Has that happened? I understand there was some movement towards that in Florida. Has that been at all successful?
Yeah, there have been pretty substantial successes. I mean, as I understand, Florida passed the first portion of the DEI bill. So you can no longer have programs in the secondary schools or in higher education teaching that some people are inherently oppressors and oppressed, that kind of thing. Chris himself is in charge of, or is one of the people that at kind of an executive level is running New College, which is, a pretty substantial unit within the University of Florida system. And it actually is pretty fun, just as someone who would occasionally meet him for a drink or something like that, to look at what's happening there. I mean, they're kind of taking the woke craziness out and just reshaping it into a normal college. Like they just started a men's baseball team. Yeah, when you attack at the state level, there is progress that you can make. And we tend to forget this, but most of the major institutions just south of the Ivies, like Ohio State, Florida State, the University of Pennsylvania, that one is an Ivy. Those are state institutions. So you can make substantial progress just by cutting off the flow of money that comes from the state, and then maybe also by challenging the alumni, which is probably the other half of it. So, I mean, like the University of Michigan has a DEI office that employs 165 people, which I think is funny and, the basis for some jokes as an old Illinois man. But you could literally stop that with gubernatorial action. Like, we're not going to direct any funds to that office.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Will Reilly, in just a moment.
Join the revolution. Online at shillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
Wilfred Reilly, and the new book is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives, Defining America's School Curricula. So, Will, let's go to some of the lies which you lay out in the book very, very well. And I want to start with brutal, true slavery unique to America and the West. And I guess the contention here is that we did it harsher than anybody else, and therefore we suffer the blame.
Slavery was something that went on for virtually all of history. And that's one of the first things that I replied to in the book. I actually opened the book with this chapter because I thought that this was such an important thing to clarify. So as the great Tom Sowell pointed out now almost 20 years ago, we think of slavery within this one specific context, which is the Atlantic slave trade in black people, black captured warriors and their families by white people. But that's a tiny chunk of the slave trade that went on globally for, virtually the entire history of man. So in the book chapter, I actually open in ancient Sumer, the dawn of man. And I go through the old hieroglyphic languages, and there's some funny stuff in them. This is humans figuring out wording, so we were very blunt and honest. Like the term for money in a lot of these languages is like bag of money or a house in exchange for a heart, if that's even supposed to be a heart specifically. But like these are the trades that define what humans think. But a slave is just defeated warrior. It's the term for man from the mountains with some slight additions, some shackle-like marks on the side. Slavery was extensive in the ancient world. Obviously slavery existed in ancient Egypt. Pharaoh is a demon figure in the Bible, and for good reason. There's also the Babylonian captivity for the Christians. Of course, we all know this. You go forward to ancient Greece, you had Aristotle literally writing texts on the kind of the care and feeding of slaves. Ancient Rome had a massive slave system. And by the way, the largest and probably worst slave system in history. Where as much as we talk about the sins of the sons of the South and all that, the Romans would take captured Ethiopian blacks, captured Gallic whites, and give them spears and make them fight elephants in gladiatorial arenas. There's no comparison to that. But I go on from there into the Arabic slave trade. The Arabic slave trade exploited Africa for far longer than the coastal white slave trade. According to one of the best academics in Senegal, it took out about 17 million, mostly black people over the years. There was, in fact, an entire war, the Zanj Wars, between Arab slavers and black people from civilized West African city-states who had been captured or who were trying to recapture the slaves. This occurred in Iraq. You can Google Zaj Wars, killed about 1 million people. So there's this entire sweep of history. The Arabs also sold whites, the Arabs and the Turks. I mean, there's a Barbary slave trade. About, if I recall correctly, 2.5 million whites were sold into slavery to black and Muslim masters in Africa and the Near East. So I talk about all this, and I obviously include, our, if you will, slave trade as well. It's called the Atlantic slave trade. It's worth noting, by the way, that the American contribution to all of this, there are about 400,000 slaves, entirely or almost entirely black, that were sold into the United States. But the full scope of the Atlantic slave trade is about 12 million people. Barbary slave trade, 2.5 million people. Arab slave trade, 17 million. We're counting both blacks and whites. So this focus on slavery as something unique about the modern America-led West is kind of crazy. And that's a good opener for the book because it provides context. No one's defending slavery, but it's perfectly fair to point out that everyone kept their captured enemies as slaves until less than 200 years ago. So the idea that there's some, this is our original sin, our unholy guilt, this language that's used, that's just nonsensical. There's no logical reason to believe this or to behave in that way. That's the point of that chapter.
So I find it interesting, Will, and I'd love to get your comment on this, that we have sexual and labor slavery going on beneath our noses today, a lot of it coming up to the southern border, and yet I don't hear the left talking about that at all. They're fixated on things that happened hundreds of years ago in America.
Well, I mean, first of all, this is a very common problem on the left. I call this Emmett Till syndrome, and obviously, all respect to, young Mr. Till. But very often I'll bring up something like, every year there are 20,000 murders of a 50-50 blacks and poor whites, basically. And I live in a community with plenty of both here in Kentucky. And so, I mean, when you talk about violence done by man to man, this seems to me to be pretty pressing, especially in the black community. Why don't we fix this problem? And when I speak to men's groups, which again contain both those groups heavy on African Americans, I'll make this point. And someone will almost always say, well, we can't just forget racism. What about Emmett Till? What about Tuskegee? I don't think that's a reply. I mean, Emmett Till, tragic case, young man, nice guy by all accounts, but this was one guy 8 years ago. So this is something that the left does all the time. It's the redirect away from a major real issue to something in the distant past that reflects the demons that they want us to mentally fight. I mean, slavery, you're mentioning the stuff on the Mexican border, that's indentured servitude, really. The cartels will hire people are abused. But there's actual slavery all over the world. I mean, in Mauritania, you have a conflict between a black Moorish group and a white Arabized group. At least the whites take slaves. I'm sure the blacks do as well when they can. And you have something like 4 million people that are just in conditions of traditional slavery. I mean, they're weaving mats out of jute and serving their master's tea sort of thing. I mean, in Nigeria, you have Boko Haram in the northern portion of the country that regularly kidnaps girls into actual sexual slavery, where they, if they're lucky, and I hate to use that term, they get married. If not, they're pretty traditional harem concubines. So, I mean, and this goes on throughout, Oman, Yemen. This goes on throughout a lot of poor Arab and black countries around the world. Islam, by the way, has always had a problem with slavery. And a lot of that is due to how the Quran treats slavery. The Quran explicitly, far more so than the Bible, which is sometimes criticized for this, authorizes slavery. You can take slaves in war. Non-Muslims can be made slaves. People who aren't people of the book, which does include Christians and Jews, if we're being honest, but Hindus and so on could be essentially preyed on at will if there's a conflict. So a lot of this is going on in Muslim countries. But why don't people talk about this today? Well, I think because it's not instrumental. Like the fact that some small Muslim nation today has a problem with sexual slavery, that doesn't really help you get reparations in the USA or get the Democratic Party elected or something like that. So black advocates, for that matter, advocates for women or the Irish community or something like that, there's no real reason for them to talk about it.
I'd like to shift gears and go to the 1960s and talk a little bit, as you do in the book, Will, about hippies and the sexual revolution, because both of those had cultural aftershocks.
Yeah, well, what I say in the book is that It's kind of past time for a revision of that golden view that so many people, especially so many upper middle class women statistically, have of the 1960s. And the 1960s are an era that a lot of people feel very positive about. And I always analogize this to the fact I'm a Chicago Bulls fan. Mm-hmm. And everyone that likes basketball has heard that the New York Knicks won the NBA championship in the mid-1970s. And we've heard it because there are about 58 books written about it. And the reason that happened is that it occurred in New York. And I think what a Bulls fan or a Lakers fan, much less a Celtics fan, will tell you is, yeah, they won it twice, all time. People wrote all those books because Madison Square Garden is 2 blocks away from the publishing houses. It's the same thing with the hippies. A lot of upper middle class kids in the 60s were hippies. They enjoyed it. It's fun to make out in the field. And we get this image of that era as defined by folk song, the Vietnam War as being unpopular and unwinnable, the Flower Children as having been in the right. But that's mostly wrong. Like, I look at a lot of the empirical data from that era, and my conclusion is that a lot of the things that came out of the 1960s, the anti-nuke movement and the eco-freako movement, which killed probably hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. Black Revolution. I mean, prior to that, African Americans largely referred to ourselves as Negroes, and we're just part of the framework of the country. But you had the Panthers, all that in the 60s. White Revolution, the Weathermen and so on were just as destructive. The drug revolution, the sexual revolution, not oral sex becoming accepted, and we're still talking about polyamory today, this sort of crap. Just on and on, really, with this. A lot of this, the anti-war movement, the anti-draft movement, the normalization of cowardice, the normalization of therapy. Basically, I make the point, and obviously people should read the book. I mean, I use facts to make this point, but I argue that a lot of this was very bad. Hippies were not the good guys. Hippies were hated during the 1960s. Their approval among black middle-class citizens was 9% at one point. The sexual revolution was largely terrible for the feminist women that were backing it. Levels of depression among women have never been higher. Number of sexual partners. And I'm not a prude at all. I don't have a moral objection to this. But in terms of levels of female happiness, numbers of sexual partners on average rose from 3 in a lifetime to 12. A large number of STDs and STIs. Previously unknown entered the scene. All this directly tracks to the 1960s. I also make the point, by the way, a little more seriously than all this sort of banter about men and women, that we could have won the Vietnam War and should have.
Will Reilly, if people would like to get a copy of Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, or if they'd like to follow the work that you do online, tell us how.
It's pretty simple. I mean, you can find me just by Googling Wilfred Reilly. That's WILFRED REILLY. Your boy is out there. Actually, if you do that, you'll find my Twitter or X. You will find my little website, which is really just a link to the university. You will find my Facebook, and most importantly, you will find all of my books and articles on the first 3 pages. Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me is currently an Amazon bestseller, so it's quite easy to track down. I've also written 2 other books, Taboo and Hate Crime Hoax, and I encourage people to go look for them.
And I hope they will. You've done a remarkable job. Will Reilly, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, thanks for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.